Hi, hey there, we're Studiologics and we are currently working on a 2.5D Souls-like game that merges the combat system from Sekiro with the visual style of Young Souls, as well as the world and level design of Hyper Light Drifter. In the last episode a few weeks back, I talked about how we arrived at our current visual style, basically by borrowing from the beat 'em up genre. And with that settled in the prototype build, the real challenge was to see if we'll be able to translate our intended combat system to the pre-existing prototype. And, well, that's exactly what I intend to talk about in this video. So, without further ado, welcome to another Stasis Devlog. So once again, Levi worked on another set of test animations that we'll be using for this combat prototype, including a 3-hit combo, parrying, and even hit reactions, but more on that later in the video. With the animation set up in the game, I worked towards adding some features that are commonplace in most action games, for instance, attack movements. If the player chooses to attack, the character will be slightly nudged forward in the direction that they are facing. And to sort of emphasize the 2.5D nature of this game, if the player decides to move the left stick up or down while still attacking, the character will move in the corresponding direction on the Z-axis. This feature pairs nicely with the next one, which is allowing the character to flip or change direction mid-combo. And last on this list, a system I'll call action catching. Due to the lack of snappy animation cancelling in this game, at least in comparison to other action games, if the player is performing an action like dashing for instance, after a certain point in the animation, if the player chooses another action like an attack, it stores that action and waits for the current animation to end, then immediately performs the action which was stored. In real time, this happens really quickly, so the player doesn't really notice the input lag. But I feel without this feature, it will just feel like the game is constantly eating your inputs, which is never fun. With that said, let's talk about depth perception. Depth perception, at least in the context of combat for this game, refers to how the player perceives hitting an opponent and vice versa. Now, in 2D games, this is pretty easy as the camera view allows the player to easily read if an attack will connect or not, which I believe is the reason why a lot of fighter games still adopt this view to this day. And even 3D games have their own unique way of tackling this problem. But in 2.5D or beat 'em up style games, it's a bit tricky. And that's mainly due to the size of the hitbox on the Z-axis. As due to how close the player or the opponent may seem on screen, it can sometimes lead to moments of inconsistencies, where the player feels like they should hit the enemy at this point, but just ends up whiffing. And with the game's intended combat system, that would just end up being extremely frustrating. So in order to solve this issue in the prototype, I set up a dummy NPC that at this point just simply plays an idle animation as well as receives damage. And through the good old try and error, I tweaked the size of the hitbox on the Z-axis so I got something that I felt quite comfortable with. Hitting the enemy felt weird and lacking in proper feedback, so I added some pushback on the enemy in the opposite direction of the player. And yes, that includes diagonal pushbacks as well, which, to be honest, is quite satisfying to see. Next up, I worked on giving the NPC some form of intelligence. I started out by making the AI chase the player when out of attacking range. This was simply done by using Unity's built-in nav mesh system, as well as a few lines of code to suit it to my game's needs, like allowing it to climb up the stairs for instance. Then, I worked on the AI's attacking system as well as making the player react to being hit. Even though it's just a prototype, I decided to also add some subtle details to it. Like for one, I enabled the AI track and sort of dash towards the player while attacking. Of course, this only happens during the first few frames of the attack animation, but I feel this helps in stopping the player from just cheesing attacks by simply sidestepping all the time. One thing I noticed while testing though was that because the AI enters hit stun while being attacked, it can be easy to just keep attacking without caring about defense, and that didn't really align with our intended vision, as an interesting flow between offense and defense felt like the right fit. And there is a lot of ways to counter this. For one, you could swarm the player with a lot of enemies like in Hyper Light Drifter, or have the player manage stamina like in Bloodborne or other Souls games, or not even let the player enter his stun at all like in 9 Souls. And while these are all good options, and some of which I even tested, I decided to go with how it was implemented in Sifu, where after a certain amount of hits, the enemy will always parry the next attack thrown at it, and through that enter a defensive state. Now, if the player chooses to attack the enemy while in this state, that attack gets parried, and from there they immediately counter attacks. Or, if the player chooses not to attack, it waits for a while before choosing to just straight up attack the player. I feel it's a really good system that creates a really nice flow in combat. And as for the attacks itself, I made the AI randomly select between 2 attacks, as well as sometimes decide to string those attacks together as a combo, just as a means to sort of keep the player on their toes, especially when parrying. Now, we can't really say that this game is Sekiro inspired without parrying, can we? That said, when implementing this feature in the prototype, I decided to make some significant tweaks to Sekiro's implementation of this, so as to hopefully make it stand out a bit more. One of which was the different types of parrying. In this game, the parry mechanic exists in 2 forms. A perfect parry, which has a really low knockback, allowing the player to quickly launch a counter attack, which feels quite empowering and is reflected in the animation. And a late parry, which has a much higher knockback and an animation that feels quite visceral, like you just barely avoided being hit, which I feel is really nice. How I got this system to work was quite simple. During the AI's attack animation, it goes through 3 different parry timings: perfect, late, and null. Null is where you just get hit. Anyway, so when the player presses the parry button, it checks for the parry timing on the current frame of the enemy's attack animation. Then afterwards, it sends the relevant information to the player's parry script, and from there the other logic on the player's end just plays out. Now, I can't take credit for this system, as I was inspired to do this after seeing it in action in Vaporworld, which is another upcoming Souls-like game, by the way. Also, the parry in this game doesn't transition into a block, it just returns back to the idle state when it's completed. While being probably a contentious decision for some, I wanted this as the player will have to learn the different parry timings of different attack animations rather than just hiding behind a block, making the defensive state of the player feel a lot more proactive, similar to how it is in Bloodborne. Next, I decided to implement the posture system from Sekiro. Now, I really feel this adds a lot of depth to the parry mechanic as well as the combat system as a whole, but there's a part of it that we would like to change, and that's the death blow. Now, I understand why it works in terms of Sekiro's combat system, but for our game, we just wanted to try something different. We decided to go with a system where if the player's posture or poise maxes out, they enter a staggered state and become open for a critical attack, which of course is very similar to how it's done in Elden Ring. And the same thing will happen to the player as well if the same conditions are met. Also, in order to encourage the player to parry more instead of dashing away from attacks like in Elden Ring or like this Raccoon over here, I decided to reduce the iframes a little bit while dashing, as well as to make the dash length quite short. Of course, this still needs some more fine-tuning so as not to force players to only parry, as I feel it adds a lot to also evading attacks, but I'll get back to this after getting some more feedback from playtesters. And that's the bulk of what has been implemented in the game so far. Obviously, there's still a lot to tweak and tune and even change, but honestly, I'm really happy with the game currently. And so, with all the lingering threads and doubts for this game basically cleared with this prototype, we can start working towards a demo build. We intend for it to be a vertical slice of our vision of the final game, but more on that in the future, of course. As for the present, I decided to make a build of this prototype available on itch.io so that you all could get to play it and hopefully also to get some feedback from you as well. It will most likely end up having some few features or stuff that I couldn't really fit into this video due to time constraints, like a health bar and all that, but you'll get to see them when you hopefully play it. Before we get to our indie game highlight of the video, I just want to say a massive thank you to all that supported us since the release of the last video. To be honest, I wasn't really expecting much when I made it, and I was even telling Levi when I released it that, oh, if we hit like 50 subs and like over 1,000 views at the end of the month, I would have been extremely happy. Only to see how you guys just basically helped us massively surpass that. I'm quite short of words on how to show my appreciation to you all, especially the number of comments that just gave really great feedback, recommendation, or sheer words of encouragement and motivation. Thank you so much. I try my best to reply to all of them, just as an extension to show my gratitude for taking the time out to at least even leave a comment. And shout out to all those who gave the video a like or even watched it to the end. I fully intend to keep showcasing what we have made, and we have a lot more interesting ideas on the way, so I hope you stick around. But once again, thank you so much for the support. I appreciate you all. If you would like to financially support us and our game dev journey, consider becoming a member of our community over at Buy Me a Coffee. By joining even the lowest tier, you get access to the community Discord and even early playtest builds of the games we make, as well as other rewards for higher tiers, of course. So if all that sounds interesting to you, the link is in the description. And with that done, our indie game highlight for this video is Grapples Galore. It's a multiplayer arena shooter with 3D physics-based grapple mechanics mixed with active ragdolls, leading to some honestly intriguing gameplay sequences. Aside from the game looking absolutely great, with the way the toon shader matches with the ragdoll-infused characters, it just looks great. The grapple mechanic itself lets you swing around the air while duking it out with other players, which has been a long-time fantasy of mine, so it's been great seeing it in gameplay form. The developer of this game, I believe, is called Soulslike and has been making some videos on his development process on his own channel, so I would recommend you checking that out as well. You can play Grapples Galore on Steam for free right now, so I really hope you give it a try. And with that said, thanks for watching the video and I'll see you in the next one.